Now that our leaf has had a season to take in CO2 and generate glucose and ultimately other important molecules for the plant, it reaches the end of the growing season. And this is going to take place in temperate and higher latitude regions around the world. It's less expensive for the tree to just give up on that leaf, on any organic carbon that's associated with that leaf, and most of the chemicals that are within that leaf, than it is to keep that leaf for the next year. So the tree essentially cuts its losses, drops the leaves after removing the pigments that it can store and use again the next year. This is why leaves change color. They go from green to yellows, reds, purples, browns, all the other possible colors, because the chlorophyll has been extracted from the leaf. So at the end of this growing season, this leaf is going to fall off the tree. A little waxy cuticle seal appears at the base of the leaf, and it's cut off from the circulation of the tree, drops to the soil, and it can get covered up by other leaves. It could be ground into the soil by a variety of animals. Here we have ground squirrels, prairie dogs. We have magpies that are constantly picking the leaves out of my gutters on my house and flinging them around. All these things interact to break down the leaves. Ultimately, bacteria and fungus will get to this carbon and convert it to CO2 and less commonly methane. We can see this happen very clearly when we look at the famous Keeling Curve of CO2 concentration. This is a measurement of CO2 since the 1950s at Mauna Loa, one of the two large volcanoes on the Big Island of Hawaii. Mauna Kea has the observatory, and Mauna Loa has a different kind of observatory, a meteorological observatory. So Mauna Kea focuses on outer space, and Mauna Loa focuses on inner space. What we see over the long term from the late 50s to the present is an increase in CO2. This is where we get most of our talking points about the increase of CO2 in the last few decades. If you look closely here, can't quite zoom in this mode, you can see that the concentration rises and falls, rises and falls, rises and falls. Zooming in a little bit, actually quite a bit, we can see this seasonal variability, this regular transition from highs to lows. This is the northern hemisphere. It's about, I believe, 17 degrees north latitude, the location of this observatory. So it's going to reflect what's going on in carbon dioxide, principally in the northern hemisphere. So what we see in the northern hemisphere is trees producing sugars, leaves come out, new growth in the spring. That is going to begin to draw CO2 down. As that new growth increases, CO2 is going to decrease. And then we reach the fall, right about now, where the leaves are changing colors. You can see that down here, a typical scene from New England. Could be New York or Vermont or New Hampshire, or any of those places. When those leaves change color, they fall off and they become part of the soil carbon component. And eventually we're going to carbon down and release it back to the atmosphere. And then subsequently it could be resorbed the following year. Generally it takes quite a bit longer than that to break a leaf down. This carbon cycling can repeat itself maybe 500 times or so before the organic carbon gets transported and buried. And by burial, we mean out of the picture, out of the system. It's not readily accessible to bacteria, so it tends to be preserved. Also, it may be a refractory compound, some material that's difficult to digest or consume, like cellulose. At that point, this carbon can be converted into rock. It can be converted into a limestone or a dolostone over a very long period of time. Or it can be converted into volcanic CO2. If organic matter gets pushed down a subduction zone via plate tectonics, eventually that material gets heated up and cooked. The more volatile material is going to be released in a volcanic event as CO2 pumped directly back into the atmosphere. If, however, this carbon is converted into a rock or converted into refractory organic matter or buried as organic matter, The carbon may spend tens to hundreds of millions of years in the rock before it gets uplifted and ultimately returns to active membership in the organic carbon cycle. We can take a look at the global carbon image here. This is principally an image of growth and productivity of organic matter. So what you'll notice is certain parts of the world, we'll start out with North America, are very dark green. This whole region here, very dark green, heavily forested, heavily vegetated by other plants. Only these mountainous and rain shadow regions of the southwestern U.S. and the Great Plains up into the prairies of Canada are relatively void of vegetation. You'll notice some bright red spots here, down here around New Orleans, up here in Manitoba. Up here we have the high Arctic Canadian lakes, also red, 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 very red here off the coast of Alaska, James Bay, along the coast of South America here. Here, the big red spot, Lake Victoria in Africa. What all these bright red areas represent are areas of very high productivity. Now, sometimes, as in this location and this location, large rivers supply nutrients to these environments. In this case, the Mississippi River here is draining much of North America. The Mississippi watershed is about here, pretty much like this. So all this land gets drained through this portal. All the nutrients that are weathered and scooped up along the way end up right here in the Gulf of Mexico. So very productive fishery. The shrimping industry is big down here. Same kind of thing here where the Amazon meets the Atlantic Ocean. This whole Amazon basin gets funneled through the Amazon River to the Atlantic Ocean right here. Down here, another large river works its way to the Atlantic Ocean from Argentina after draining much of Patagonia here, and so on around the world. In the wintertime, we shut things down. So here in North America, much of the continent gets covered down around to the Mason-Dixon line, southern Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey in the east. Out here in the Midwest, we're talking about Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa being kind of on the boundary here of snow versus no snow, winter versus no winter. So the leaves fall off the trees here in the winter. Strangely, there are trees in Australia that don't lose their leaves, their bark falls off. Go figure. Now, we can summarize this in this diagram here. So we'll start out with volcanism. So we have plate tectonic activity, forces organic matter into a subduction zone. It's subducted, it's heated, it's volatilized, and the CO2 comes out of the volcano into the atmosphere where it's free to move around the world. It may get incorporated into precipitation and fall as acid rain. This acid rain can dissolve rock. This was first noted to be a problem in the Adirondack area of central New York. Famous playground for rich people, mostly from New York City. So this acid rain dissolving the rock is going to produce ions that are going to enter a river system and flow into the ocean. Now, once these ions are in the ocean, calcium and carbonate principally, we may get precipitation of skeletons, as it says here in the diagram. These can be corals. They can be what are called coral and algae, which are actually more important than corals for producing carbonate. We all know about coral reefs because we call the structures coral reefs. But in reality, the coral reef forms a framework that's filled in to a large degree by algae. So it's more appropriate to call them algal reefs than coral reefs. But, corals have their proponents. Okay, so we have weathering and erosion of rock that is going to feed ions into the ocean. These skeletons are precipitated by a variety of organisms. They can be deposited, where it can be buried, compressed, and lithified, turned into rock again. Over here on the continental surface, we have respiration. We have the breakdown of organic matter that was produced maybe the previous year via photosynthesis. So photosynthesis produces the organic matter. Maybe the leaves that were produced one year fall off. They respire. They go back into the atmosphere as CO2. Turns out that we put this whole system into overdrive. This breakdown of organic matter that occurs naturally has been ramped up by us burning fossil fuels. Organic matter that was created long, long ago, in some cases hundreds of millions of years ago by photosynthesis, gets locked away, buried as an oil deposit or a coal deposit, for example, or just as interstitial carbon in some rock, like a limestone. It may take hundreds of millions of years for that to be tectonically uplifted, as we see here, and then ultimately ground back down to flat by physical weathering and chemical weathering. So the physical weathering here is going to be via glacial activity and frost wedging, also banging of the rocks together by the rivers. So the physical weathering coupled with chemical weathering, the mixture of CO2 with water results in carbonic acid. This acid dissolves rocks. It dissolves carbonate rocks and it dissolves silicate rocks. So one of the reasons the Earth is able to maintain this liquid water that does so much for and against the rock record is that the planet recycles elements needed for life. These elements include carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. The big four, at least for some people. Now, these are generally rare. Carbon, maybe not so much, but nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur are the limiting nutrients. They're the nutrients that plants really need to get a hold of if they're to be productive. Ultimately, these recycling systems, the systems that recycle these necessary elements, are controlled by plate tectonic processes. This linkage between tectonic activity and the carbon cycle is important for the regulation of atmospheric CO2 concentrations and therefore important to climate. As an example here, a cartoon example, we have yearly CO2 emissions, the average emission from volcanoes for a given year, depicted here, compared to annual CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use and land conversion. This is generally slash and burn agriculture. We go into a forest, we chop it down, we grind it up, we burn it, and we use that land for agriculture. This circulation of the solid Earth, along with the circulation of the atmosphere and the circulation of the ocean, move these elements from one environment to another. Elements that are released for use in the biosphere, when rocks weather, volcanoes erupt, and nitrogen is made available from the atmosphere by chemical transformations forced by lightning, are depicted here. Here we have some limestone rock weathering. This is natural, it's not man-made. This rock weathers along zones of weakness or fracture here. And as the rain continues to fall with that carbonic acid in it, it's going to dissolve these rocks, make these cracks, dissolution features wider, bigger. Ultimately, these blocks of limestone will become rounded and small and insignificant. Here we have a volcanic eruption that is emitting CO2. So organic matter that was forced down a subduction zone off the coast here is cooked and converted into CO2 and ejected from the volcano in the atmosphere. Along with this ejection of CO2, we have static electricity generating lightning. This lightning can convert elemental nitrogen to a fixed form of nitrogen that can be used by plants. Now, if you've been outside during a thunderstorm, you may have noticed some interesting smells or odors. One of those would be ozone, and that's something, it's kind of that electricity smell you get from old, inefficient electronic devices. Old toys, for instance, emit ozone when they're operating. And we don't really smell the nitrogen that's being produced, but it is being produced by lightning. Compared to the nitrogen that's being fixed by bacteria, this is really insignificant, kind of a stretch. So the much higher rates of utilization of these nutrients by the biosphere is only possible because we have a very efficient nutrient recycling program. Nutrients are substances normally obtained in the diet that are essential to organisms. So we have a list of vitamins that we should be taking, or maybe we get enough of them in our diet if our diet's appropriate. Plants have the same thing. the same kinds of needs, the same nutrients are required for them to be as healthy as possible. These nutrient elements that get incorporated into living organisms while they're growing are rapidly released when an organism dies. This is fortuitous that these much needed nutrients are made available again. The cycle gets repeated many, many times before the elements may leave the biosphere. There's a Scottish comedian named Billy Connolly who a few years ago was being interviewed, and he said at one point he was walking out of a building and a man walked up to him and said, "Can you spare some change?" And I look at the man and I said, "Spare change? Can there be such a concept?" What he's talking about is nutrients. Well, he wasn't really talking about nutrients, but I'll talk about nutrients. So can you spare some nutrients? Spare change is a lot like spare nutrients. If you hand money to someone on the street, they're probably going to spend it pretty quickly. That goes into someone else's hands, then someone else's hands, and someone else's hands. So much like the spare change business, spare nutrients get shifted from organism to organism fairly rapidly. And that's because they're valuable, because they're necessary. So all of this put together is known as the terrestrial organic carbon cycle. In this terrestrial organic carbon cycle, there are some short subcycles that last years to decades. The growing of perennial plants, for instance, lilac bushes, other shrubs, they may live to be 10 or 20 years of age, then they die and they get recycled. Now, other cycles may last for centuries. Big old trees like the redwood trees may live to be thousands of years of age. Or if we bury this material as rock or organic matter, it can be put away for hundreds of millions of years. So it's not readily available spare change. It's now entered the deep, dark crypt of the New York Stock Exchange. Money is there somewhere. We'll never see it. There's a video that I posted in your carbon module. It's listed down here. It's called Carbon Cycling from Space. I believe that's what I called it. Give that a look when you get a chance. Okay, so you were probably wondering about this slide that popped up at the beginning of the last lecture, Pie Town. Pie Town is a real place in New Mexico. It is just, about an hour away from Truth or Consequences. That is also a town in New Mexico. And there's another strange one. I'll think of it after I finish this. It's a weird one. Just take a look at a map of western New Mexico. You'll see some stuff. Okay, so Pie Town. Why are we talking about Pie Town? Well, near Pie Town is a very important historic park. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's called the Chaco Culture National Historical Park. And it is the best, most complete set of buildings, ancient architectural wonders outside of Mexico in North America. So this Chaco culture thrived between about 850 AD and 1250 AD. It was believed to be a ceremonial center. I don't really know. I guess you might consider it to be sort of like the Vatican today. Here in this figure it says AD 850 to 1150. They were really around for about 100 years beyond this, so really around 1250 or so, close to 1250. Being a ceremonial center, there's some conjecture, some confusion, some arguing about how many people actually lived here. Somewhere between 70 and 1,000 is the estimate. Recently, excavation of a grave of the people that were considered to be the leaders or the royalty at this time indicates that women were most likely the leaders of this culture, of this ceremonial center at least, and that all of the women buried in this important gravesite were related. And that implies that power was passed down from a woman to her daughters for hundreds of years. Now, this is a artist's rendition. It looks pretty similar to this today, actually. I mean, some of these walls aren't quite as pristine, but in general, the size and the shape are well preserved. You can walk up here if you got an hour or two and get a really good overview of this site. Here are a couple images I took last year. Using a new camera, I got robbed in Vegas. In the daytime, somebody smashed the window of my rental car and took all my stuff. So this is a new camera that I didn't own the day before. This is a ceremonial structure. People would have entered this. It would have been covered with some kind of roofing at the time, and they would have done their important things here in this room. You can see it was a very sophisticated culture. Some of these buildings are 5 stories high. You might think of them as the original skyscrapers. Again, these were built 1,000 years ago in New Mexico. You'll see lots of wood throughout the structures. This wood was the base of flooring. So there would have been a floor here. See another floor here, and so on, building upward to the sky. So a sophisticated culture, a powerful culture. They were importing scarlet macaws from Central America as a sign of wealth. They were importing cacao, or the main ingredient for chocolate, and they were drinking it out of vessels that were very similar to the chocolate drinking vessels that Mexicans were using at the time. Well, people living in Mexico at the time. These people suddenly disappeared, and it's believed they disappeared when the carbon cycle came to a screeching halt in this area. The rainfall decreased. When the rainfall decreased, the viability of farming decreased, and the people simply moved away. This is the story for many of these sites throughout the desert southwest of the U.S. The Anasazi, as the people are known, the ancient ones, abandoned many of these sites pretty much at the same time around the region. So it's believed to be a multi-year drought that forced people away from this sophisticated settlement. So this was 1,000 years ago. We still see this happening today. These are some images from Africa, Ireland, North Korea, where people are starving. In this case, starvation is related to downturn in agriculture that was caused by a drought. Here in North Korea, drought and floods caused a wild fluctuation in rice yields. And in Ireland, during the 1840s and 1850s, they went through the potato famine, an gortamor, as you'd say in Irish. It was a time when a fungus infested the potato crop. So in this case, it wasn't not enough rain. It might have been too much rain, and cooler temperatures resulted in the failure of the monoculture here, differing from failure of monoculture here and the monoculture here. So this kind of thing happens in the modern world. It's not a historical artifact of when humans were susceptible to nature. Humans are very susceptible to nature to this day. And this often leads to unrest.